Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Rocky Will Read. I am going to be reading from the Mary Trump recently released book, Too Much and Never Enough: How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. Today I'm going to be reading the prologue and probably a little bit more. And thank you for joining. I'd always liked my name. As a kid at sailing camp in the 1970s, everybody called me Trump. It was a source of pride, not because the name was associated with power and real estate. Back then, my family was unknown outside of Brooklyn and Queens, but because something about the sound of it suited me. A tough 6 year old, afraid of nothing. In the 1980s, when I was in college and my Uncle Donald had started branding all of his buildings in Manhattan, my feelings about my name became more complicated. 30 years later, on April 4th, 2017, I was in the quiet car of an Amtrak train headed to Washington, D.C. for a family dinner at the White House. 10 days later, I had received an email inviting me to a birthday celebration for my aunts Mary Ann, turning 80, and Elizabeth, turning 75. Their younger brother Donald had occupied the Oval Office since January. After I emerged into Union Station, with its vaulted ceilings and black and white marble floors, I passed a vendor who had set up an easel with buttons for sale. My name in a red circle with a splash through it: Deport Trump, Dump Trump, and Trump is a witch. I put on my sunglasses and picked up my pace. I took a cab to the Trump International Hotel, which was comping my family for one night. After checking in, I walked through the atrium and looked up at the glass ceiling and the blue sky beyond. The three-tiered crystal chandeliers that hung beyond from the central beam of the interconnected girders arching overhead cast a soft light. On one side, armchairs, settees, and couches, royal blue, robin eggs blue, ivory, were arranged in small groups. On the other, tables and chairs, circled in a large bar where I was later scheduled to meet my brother. I had expected the hotel to be vulgar and gilded. It wasn't. My room was also tasteful, but my name was plastered everywhere on everything: Trump shampoo, Trump conditioner, Trump slippers, Trump shower cap, Trump shoe polish, Trump sewing kit, and Trump bathrobe. I opened the refrigerator, grabbed a split of Trump white wine, and poured it down my Trump throat so it could course through my Trump bloodstream and hit the pleasure center of my Trump brain. An hour later, I met my brother, Frederick Christ Trump III, whom I've called Fritz since we were kids, and his wife, Lisa. Soon we were joined by the rest of our party: my Aunt Mary Ann, the eldest of Fred and Mary Trump's 5 children, and a respected federal appeals court judge; my Uncle Robert, the baby of the family, who for a short time had been one of Donald's employees in Atlantic City before leaving on bad terms in the early 1990s; and his girlfriend, my Aunt Elizabeth, the middle Trump child, and her husband Jim; my cousin David Desmond, Mary Ann's only child and the oldest Trump grandchild, and his wife, and a few of my aunt's closest friends. The only Trump sibling who would be missing from the celebration was my father, Frederick Christ Trump Jr., the oldest son, whom everybody had called Freddie. He had died more than 35 years before. When we were finally all together, we checked in with the White House security agents outside, then piled haphazardly into the 2 White House vans like a JV lacrosse team. Some of the older guests had trouble negotiating the steps. Nobody was comfortable with squeezing onto the bench seats. I wondered why the White House hadn't thought to send at least one limo for my aunts. As we pulled into the South Lawn driveway 10 minutes later, two guards came out of the security hut to inspect the underside of the van before we drove through the front gate. After a short drive, we stopped at a small security building adjacent to the east wing and disembarked. We went inside one by one as our names were called, handed over our phones and bags, and walked through a metal detector. Once inside the White House, we walked in twos and threes through the long corridors, past windows looking out on gardens and lawns, past life-size paintings of former First Ladies. I stopped in front of Hillary Clinton's portrait and stood silently for a minute. I wondered again how this could have happened. There was no reason for me to ever have imagined that I'd visit the White House. Certainly not under these circumstances. The whole thing felt surreal. I looked around. The White House was elegant, grand, and stately, and I was about to see my uncle, the man who lived there, for the first time in 8 years. We emerged from the shadows of the hallway onto the portico surrounding the rose garden and stopped outside the Oval Office. Through the French doors, I could see that a meeting was still in progress. Vice President Mike Pence stood off to the side, but Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, Senator Chuck Schumer, and a dozen other congresspeople and staffers were gathered around Donald, who sat behind the Resolute desk. The tableau reminded me of my grandfather's tactics. He always made his supplicants come to him, either at his Brooklyn office or his house in Queens, and he remained seated while they stood. In late autumn 1985, a year after I'd taken a leave of absence from Tufts University, I took my place in front of him and asked his permission to return to school. He looked up at me and said, "That's stupid. What do you want to do that for? Just go to trade school and become a receptionist." "Because I want to get my degree." I must have said it with a hint of annoyance, because my grandfather narrowed his eyes and looked at me for a second as if reevaluating me. The corner of his mouth lifted in a sneer, and he laughed. "That's nasty," he said. A few minutes later, the meeting broke up. The Oval Office was both smaller and less intimate than I imagined. My cousin Eric and his wife Lara, who I never met, were standing right by the door. So I said, "Hi, Eric. It's your cousin Mary." "Of course, I know who you are," he said. "Well, it's been a while," I said. "I think the last time we saw each other, you were still in high school." He shrugged and said, "That's possibly true." He and Lara walked away without introducing us. I looked around. Melania, Ivanka, Jared, and Donnie had arrived and were standing next to Donald, who remained seated. Mike Pence continued to lurk on the other side of the room with a half-dead smile on his face, like the chaperone everyone wanted to avoid. Like the chaperone everybody wanted to avoid. I stared at him, hoping to make eye contact, but he never looked my way. "Excuse me, everyone," the White House photographer, a petite young woman in a dark pantsuit, announced in an upbeat voice. "Let's get you all together so I can take some pictures before we go upstairs." She instructed us to surround Donald, who still had not gotten up from the desk. The photographer raised her camera. "1, 2, 3, smile," she said. After the pictures had been taken, Donald stood up and pointed to a framed black and white photograph of my grandfather, which was propped up on a table behind the desk. "Marianne, isn't that a great picture of Dad?" It was the same photograph that he had on the side table in the library of my grandparents' house. In it, my grandfather was still a young man with receding dark hair, a mustache, and a look of command that I had never seen falter until his dementia set in. We all seen it 1,000 times. "Maybe you should get a picture of Mom too," Marianne suggested. That's a great idea, Donald said, as though it never occurred to him. Somebody get me a picture of Mom. We spent a few more minutes in the Oval Office, taking turns sitting behind the Resolute desk. My brother took a picture of me, and when I looked at it later, I noticed my grandfather hovering behind me like a ghost. The White House historian joined us just outside the Oval Office, and we proceeded to the executive residence on the second floor for a tour to be followed by dinner. Once upstairs, we proceeded to the Lincoln bedroom. I took a quick look inside and was surprised to see a half-eaten apple on the bedside table. As the historian told us stories about what had happened in the room through the years, Donald pointed vaguely once in a while and declared, "This place has never looked better since George Washington lived here." The historian was too polite to point out that the house hadn't been opened until after Washington had died. The group moved down the hall toward the treaty room and the executive dining room. Donald stood in the doorway, greeting people as they entered. I was one of the last to arrive. I hadn't yet said hello, and when he saw me, he pointed at me with a surprised look on his face, then said, "I specifically asked for you to be here." That was the kind of thing he often said to charm people. And he had a knack for tailoring his comment to the occasion, which was all the more impressive because I knew it wasn't true. He opened his arms, and then for the first time in my life, he hugged me. The first thing I noticed about the executive dining room was its beauty. The dark wood polished to perfection, the exquisite place settings, and the hand-drawn calligraphy of the place cards and menus. Iceberg lettuce salad, mashed potatoes, Trump family staples, and Wagyu beef fillet. The second thing I noticed after sitting down was the seating arrangement. In my family, you can always gauge your worth by where you were seated. I didn't mind. All of the people I felt comfortable with, my brother and my sister-in-law, Mary Ann's stepdaughter and her husband, were seated near me. Each of the waiters carried a bottle of red wine and a bottle of white, real wine, not Trump wine. That was unexpected. In my entire life, there had never been any alcohol at a family function. Only Coke and apple juice had been served at my grandparents' house. Halfway through the meal, Jared walked into the dining room. "Oh, look," Ivanka said, clapping her hands. "Jared's back from his trip to the Middle East," as if we hadn't just seen him in the Oval Office. He walked over to his wife, gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, then bent over Donald, who was seated next to Ivanka. They spoke quietly for a couple of minutes, and then Jared left. He didn't acknowledge anybody else, not even my aunts. As he crossed the threshold, Donnie leaped out of his chair and bounded after him like an excited puppy. As dessert was being served, Robert stood up, wine glass in hand. "It is such an honor to be here with the President of the United States," he said. "Thank you, Mr. President, for allowing us to be here to celebrate our sisters' birthdays." I thought back to the last time the family had celebrated Father's Day at Peter Luger Steakhouse in Brooklyn. Then as now, Donald and Rob had been sitting next to each other, with me directly across from them. Without any explanation, Donald had turned to Rob and said, "Look." He bared his teeth and pointed at his mouth. "What?" Rob asked. Donald had simply pulled his lips back farther and pointed more empathetically. Rob had started to look nervous. I had no idea what was going on, but watched with amusement while I sipped my Coke. "Look," Donald said through his gritted teeth. "What do you think?" "What do you mean?" Rob's embarrassment was palpable. He had glanced around him to make sure nobody was looking at him and whispered, "Is there something in my teeth?" The bowls of creamed spinach scattered around the table rendered that a distinct possibility. Donald had relaxed his mouth and stopped pointing. The contemptuous look on his face summed up the entire history of their relationship. "I got my teeth whitened. What do you think?" he asked dryly. After Rob's remarks, Donald shot him the same dismissive look that I had seen at Peter Luger's almost 20 years before. Then, Diet Coke, glass in hand, Donald made some perfunctory remarks about my aunt's birthdays, after which he gestured towards his daughter-in-law. "Laura, there," he said. "I barely even know who the fuck she was. Honestly. But then she gave a great speech during the campaign in Georgia supporting me." By then, Laura and Eric had been together for almost 8 years. So presumably, Donald had at least met her at their wedding. But it sounded as if he hadn't known who she was until she had said something nice about him at a campaign rally during the election. As usual with Donald, the story mattered more than the truth, which was easily sacrificed, especially if a lie made the story sound better. When Marianne's turn came, she said, "I want to thank you for making the trip to celebrate our birthdays. We've come a long way since that night when Freddie dumped a bowl of mashed potatoes on Donald's head because he was being such a brat." Everybody familiar with the legendary mashed potato story laughed, everyone except Donald, who listened with his arms tightly crossed and a scowl on his face, as he did whenever Marianne mentioned it. It upset him, and as if he were that 7-year-old boy, he clearly still felt the sting of that long-ago humiliation. Unprompted, my cousin Donnie, who returned from chasing down Jared, stood up to speak. Instead of toasting our aunt, he gave a sort of campaign speech. "Last November, the American people saw something special and voted for a president who they knew understood them. They saw what a great family this is, and they connected with our values." I glanced at my brother and rolled my eyes. I flagged down one of the waiters. "And can I have some more wine?" I asked. He returned quickly with 2 bottles and asked if I preferred red or white. "Yes, please," I said. As soon as we finished dessert, everybody rose. Only 2 hours had elapsed since we'd entered the Oval Office. But the meal was over, and it was time to leave. From beginning to end, we had spent about twice as much time at the White House as we ever had at my grandparents' house for Thanksgiving or Christmas, but still less time with Donald than Kid Rock, Sarah Palin, and Ted Nugent would 2 weeks later. Somebody suggested that we take individual pictures with Donald, though not the guest of honor. When it was my turn, Donald smiled for the camera and gave a thumbs up, but I can see the exhaustion behind the smile. It seemed that keeping up with the cheerful facade was wearing on him. "Don't let them get you down," I said to him as my brother took the picture. It wasn't long after his first national security advisor had been fired in disgrace, and the cracks in his presidency were already beginning to show. Donald jutted out his chin and clenched his teeth, looking for a moment like the ghost of my grandmother. "They're not going to get me," he said. When Donald announced his run for the presidency on June 16, 2015, I didn't take it seriously. I didn't think Donald took it seriously. He simply wanted to free the public. He simply wanted the free publicity for his brand. He'd done that sort of thing before, when his poll numbers started to rise and he may have received tacit assurances from Russian President Vladimir Putin that Russia would do everything it could to swing the election in his favor. The appeal of winning grew. "He's a clown," my Aunt Marianne said during one of our regular lunches at the time. "This will never happen." I agreed. We talked about how his reputation as a faded reality star and failed businessman would doom his run. Does anybody even believe the bullshit that he's a self made man? What has he even accomplished on his own? I asked. Well, Marianne said, as dry as the Sahara, he has had 5 bankruptcies. When Donald started addressing the opioid crisis and using my father's history with alcoholism to burnish his anti-addiction bona fides to seem more sympathetic, both of us were very angry. He's using your father's memory for political purposes, Marianne said. And that's a sin, especially since Freddie should have been the star of the family. We thought the blatant racism on display during Donald's announcement speech would be a deal breaker, but we were disabused of that idea when Jerry Falwell Jr. and other white evangelicals started endorsing him. Marianne, a devout Catholic since her conversion 5 decades earlier, was incensed. "What the fuck is wrong with them?" she said. The only time Donald went to church was when the cameras were there. It's mind-boggling. He has no principles. None. Nothing Donald said during the campaign, from his disparagement of the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, arguably the most qualified presidential candidate in the history of the country, as a nasty woman, to his mocking of Serge Kovaleski, a disabled New York Times reporter, deviated from my expectation of him. In fact, I was reminded of every family meal I'd ever attended, during which Donald had talked about all of the women he considered ugly, fat slobs or men, usually more accomplished or powerful, he called losers, while my grandfather and Marianne, Elizabeth, and Robert all laughed and joined in. That kind of casual dehumanization of people was commonplace at the Trump dinner table. What did surprise me was that he kept getting away with it. When he received the nomination, the things I had thought would disqualify him only seemed to strengthen his appeal to his base. I still wasn't concerned. I was confident he could never be elected, but the idea that he had a shot at it was unnerving. Late in the summer of 2016, I considered speaking out about the ways I knew Donald to be completely unqualified. By this time, he had emerged relatively unscathed from the Republican National Convention and his call for Second Amendment people to stop Hillary Clinton. Even his attack on Khizr and Ghazala Khan, Gold Star parents, whose son Humayun, a U.S. Army captain, had died in Iraq, seemed not to matter. Where the majority of Republicans polled still supported him after the Access Hollywood tape was released, I knew I had made the right decision. I began to feel as though I were watching my family history and Donald's central role in it playing out on a grand scale. Donald's competition in the race was being held to higher standards, just as my father had always been, while he continued to get away with and even be rewarded for increasingly crass, irresponsible, and despicable behavior. This can't possibly be happening again, I thought. But it was. The media failed to notice that not one member of Donald's family, apart from his children, his son-in-law, and his current wife, said a word in support of him during the entire campaign. Marianne told me she was lucky because as a federal judge, she needed to maintain her objectivity. She may have been the only person in the country given her position as his sister and her professional reputation, who, if she had spoken out about Donald's complete unfitness for the office, might have made a difference. But she and her own secrets to keep. I wasn't entirely surprised when she told me after the election that she'd voted for her brother out of family loyalty. Growing up in the Trump family, particularly as Freddie's child, presented certain challenges. In some ways, I've been extremely fortunate. I attended excellent private schools and had the security of first-rate medical insurance for most of my life. There was also, though, a built-in sense of scarcity that applied to all of us, except Donald. After my grandfather died in 1999, I learned that my father's line had been erased from the will as if Fred Trump's oldest son had never existed, and a lawsuit followed. In the end, I concluded that if I spoke publicly about my uncle, I would be painted as a disgruntled, disinherited niece looking to cash in or settle a score. In order to understand what brought Donald and all of us to this point, we need to start with my grandfather and his own need for recognition, a need that propelled him to encourage Donald's reckless hyperbole and unearned confidence that hid Donald's pathological weaknesses and insecurities. As Donald grew up, he was forced to become his own cheerleader first, because he needed his father to believe he was better and a more confident son than Freddie was. Then, because Fred required it of him, and finally because he began to believe his own hype, even as he paradoxically suspected on a very deep level that nobody else did. By the time of the election, Donald met any challenges to his sense of superiority with anger, his fear of vulnerability so effectively buried that he didn't even have to acknowledge they existed, and he never would. In the 1970s, after my grandfather had already been preferring and promoting Donald for years, the New York media picked up the baton and began disseminating Donald's unsubstantiated hype. In the 1980s, the banks joined in when they began to fund his ventures. Their willingness, and then their need, to foster his increasingly unfounded claims to success hung on the hopes of recouping their losses. After a decade during which Donald floundered, dragged down by bankruptcies and reduced to fronting for a series of failed projects and products from steaks to vodka, the television producer Mark Burnett gave him yet another chance. The Apprentice traded on Donald's image as the